everybody. Welcome to today's Lunch and Learn. We're so excited that you're here today to join us and Ecologic. My name is Elizabeth Beek. I'm the Adult Education Coordinator here at Trees Atlanta. I'd also love to give a shout out to Rebecca Gilbert, our Director of Education, who is here today, and of course, our speaker. Thank you so much. So just before we get started, Trees Atlanta is a nonprofit. It's our 40th anniversary this year, so we're celebrating a lot with some great programs like today's. And our mission is to protect and improve Atlanta's urban forests by planting, conserving, and educating. You can learn more about some of the great programs, other great volunteer opportunities on the website listed here. We hope you join us in other parts of the organization as well. We would love to thank our sponsors for today's session and other sessions, the City of Atlanta, for all they do in supporting urban forest education. And to help make today's webinar go as smoothly as possible, we encourage you to use the Q&A button at the toolbar, which should be at the bottom of your screen, and you can submit your questions there, and we'll be answering them and discussing them live today on the webinar. Also, after today's Lunch and Learn, we're going to be sending out an email that has a survey, and your responses help us make Lunch and Learns like these even better for the next time. So thank you for doing that. And we encourage you to follow us on social media. We also have some great newsletters that will give you monthly updates on what's going on at Trees Atlanta and how you can become more involved. And today we're obviously doing Intro to Landscape Regeneration, but there will be 3 more additional sessions with Tea and Ecologic and Trees Atlanta, and we're so excited and hope that you will join those. Please look on our calendar of events and register if you have not already. And also, this is part of our Stay in the Forest certification program. We're really excited about this program. It's our newest community action program. It's a hands-on program. It guides and empowers everyday people like ourselves with practical knowledge and skills. And we really believe that neighbor by neighbor and property by property, we can grow and connect a network of forests, big and small. And there's some really great stewardship tracks. If you're excited about amphibians, we work with the Amphibian Foundation. If you're excited about birds, we work with Birds Georgia. There's all sorts of ways for you to get involved. So we encourage you to check out our City in the Forest certified program, which these sessions help support. And with that, I'm so excited to introduce you to our speaker today. We are going to be hearing from Tea Povolny, who's the founder of Ecologic. Ecologic provides regenerative landscape management services to private and public clients in the Atlanta metro area. And their mission is to inspire responsible stewardship of native ecologies for healthier lands and communities. They do everything from invasive species removal to rain gardens to native plant installations. And they want to show people that their actions can have beautiful and meaningful impacts. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tea. Thanks so much.
We're just going to jump into it. For those of you who aren't familiar with Ecologic, we specialize in habitat regeneration that covers a lot of different types of services. But usually people find us because they're looking for, at the very least, invasive removal. We're not actually going to start there. We're going to start with talking about what regeneration is and how can you approach it in a way that is going to be sustainable so you don't lose momentum and motivation, and you can continue a path forward over time in a practical way. All right, so this is one of our clients where you can see at the top, we did a lawn conversion to meadow at the bottom there. To start off, we need to do a couple of definitions. First of all, what do we mean when we're talking about regeneration? And that's going to bring us to another term called responsive management or responsive care. Now, I like to start by defining regeneration by talking about what it's not, because it's not a lot of things, and mostly it's not landscaping, but it's also not those things that we think of that do similar things for the ecology, like restoration or conservation. And the difference is that regeneration is really looking at what is already happening on the site, the stages of succession, that healing that already exists is what regeneration uses to get to a place that's better rather than to conserve what's already there or to try and get to something that was before that maybe is no longer possible. So we really want to look at the state of things as they are and make our decisions based off of that. And that brings us to responsive management, which is all about responding, right? Not reacting. We don't presume or impose an idea of how the landscape is going to be. Rather, we're going to have to respond to it. So that means we're going to have to do some observation, which we're going to talk about in a moment. And here are some cute critters from some of our sites. So, in order to do responsive management and regeneration, this really requires you to consider some things and decide whether or not you're willing to put yourself in a place where you can make responsive decisions instead of reactive decisions. So, when we talk about regeneration, we're really talking about gaining a sense of perspective, a shift in perspective, where you can toggle between the micro, what's happening right in front of you, and how that is affected by the macro, right? We have a perception of how things move because we're living at our time scale, but we have to understand that the landscape is moving at a different time scale. We have a geological timeline that we have to respect. You know, a lot of these landscapes are millennia old, so that should inform how we're going to make decisions about how we want to shape things for the future. And that really is going to determine our success, is whether or not we can move between those two perspectives of the really, really big and the really, really small. And in doing that, what you should be encouraged to do is nurture the relationships with these different entities that are informing your space, right? As you look at this little small pollinators and the microorganisms and how they are affecting your space, what you're really doing is you are entering a relationship with them in the same way that you might with anybody else who you could call a friend or an acquaintance. This is going to help you really understand how the space around you behaves. You know, not to get too wooey about it, but as you spend time with your space and observe how it's behaving, you will see that it has a behavior, right? All of these things happen on a cycle. We're going to talk about seasonality in a second. Um, but you can predict after you observe uh, certain behaviors from your landscape how it's going to react to your actions. So you're not just going in blind, which is really what I'm trying to prevent people from doing moving forward with this perspective shift in regeneration, right? We can make much better decisions if we understand how all of these things are working together. And in doing that, you will start to understand that there really isn't a right way and a wrong way to do any of this, but there might be better ways or ways that further your intentions that are more useful to you and what you're trying to achieve. And there might be ways that ultimately don't help you achieve what you're trying to do. And so that's also what we're trying to parse apart in understanding how do you implement regeneration. Now, using regenerative methods means you have to respect the stages of succession. There's no way around it. But if you can understand that the stages of succession happen, which very quickly the stages of succession that I'm just referring to. If you start with nothing on a landscape, it's going to go through different stages. The first one is usually things like grasslands, right? That gets more complex to shrublands, and eventually it develops into different types of forest with more strata. You have to understand that that is just how the landscape behaves. If you understand that and you use that, you can actually use it to your advantage, right? You can speed up some of these things, but you can never ever skip them. So you have to respect that they exist. And in understanding all of these things and trying to use that as the foundation of how you're going to move forward with your decision making, you're always going to have an intention, and that should precede anything that you do in the landscape. As much as I'm a big fan in going out and experimenting, you want to understand why it is you're doing what you're doing before you do it, even if you make a mistake and you're wrong about it. All right, so we understand what is required of us to take a regenerative approach. Now we're going to do some planning. So, one of the things that I see with people the most is that their goals do not um, do not match their situation, right? You want to have a realistic expectation for what your landscape can do and what regeneration can do for you. So you have to make sure that whatever your goals are, they're actually based in the principles of regeneration. So we talked about a few of them. We talked about the stages of succession. We talked about responding as part of our management style. So that means we can't have any hard and fast plans completely. There always has to be a sense of adaptability or flexibility, right? And ultimately, what you are doing, what your task is to facilitate the healing that's already happening on the landscape. That's what regeneration is. It's healing. If you can think of the landscape kind of like the way the body is, because there is a lot of similarity, and all living organisms have this capability of healing. You know, someone who helps to heal a body, like a doctor or a physical therapist, they are not inventing the parts of your body that will heal, right? Your skin is what mends itself. The landscape is the same. The tools that will create the stages of succession and help you regenerate your land already exist on the landscape. Your job is to facilitate them, to recognize them, and to support them. And if you can do that, you won't be fighting against the systems that are already in place, right? You will be supported in your own efforts. How wonderful could that possibly be? So, all of this good decision making that you're going to be doing, of course, has to be shaped by the context, by what it is that you're working with. One of my backgrounds is landscape architecture, and it's just fascinating how how one of the legacies of landscape architecture is treating the landscape like it is a painting. Well, it's not a painting. It's not a blank canvas. It has a personality. There is something already there. So you have to take this into account. And truly, if you are an artist, you already are doing this anyway, because you are taking your materials into account and you are understanding how they will behave. So perhaps there's more of a similarity than I gave it initially account for. But anyway, so you want to really understand, what goes on with your landscape, which means you're collecting observation, and you can really supplement this with information that's available to you about things like watersheds in your neighborhood, and even the history of your backyard is very informative. You can do soil samples, all kinds of wonderful information that you can gather. So it doesn't just start and stop with what are the plants on my site, but what's the topography? How is the sun hitting, different parts of my yard? What is the different plant compositions? So many questions to ask yourself. They're innumerable. In setting realistic goals, another place where people really get hung up, right, is taking on more than you could possibly do in the amount of time that regeneration requires. So start small. Start with small things. And if you start small, you can always add more, right? It's just like anything else. If you start with your whole yard and your whole yard is completely grown over and you can't even see where to begin, you will get overwhelmed inevitably. So just you know, if you have to, put your little blinders on and do one little section, or just focus on one little species, or do one little project, and then add more as you're comfortable. But especially when it comes to budgeting, you know, don't think too big all at once. Yes, you want to think about the whole system, but you can't eat the whole elephant in one go. So you've got to make elephant jerky and elephant stew, and you've got to freeze some, and you've got to share with your friends, and you've got to space it out over time. So that spacing out over time is just key to it. Another part of setting realistic goals is defining clear measures of success. And that just means being able to recognize when success is happening. Regeneration can be very subtle. If you're not doing that observation and you're not creating that relationship and you do not know the behavior of your landscape, you might not notice when things are going well. So it's very helpful to record your progress. I'm going to give a shout out to a friend of mine, Michael Hudgens of Woodskeeper, because he's absolutely phenomenal at recording his progress. And I have to say, nothing will make you feel more motivated or like you are making an impact if you can see, the visual record of this is what it looked like 2 years ago. This is what it looks like now. So do yourself a favor, make it easy for yourself to appreciate that you have come as far as you have. Otherwise you're going to be looking at it and be like, it doesn't look any different. I don't know. So, a couple more things to consider as you are planning. There are lots of questions that you should be asking yourself on the front end of this. And uh, one of them is, why do you even want to use regeneration as a method, right? And I mean this in like as personal of terms as you can make it. Yes, I'm going to assume everybody here wants the planet to be okay, and we care about um, biodiversity, and we care about protecting nature and all of those good things. But when I mean like, why do you want to regenerate your yard? You should think in personal terms. How does this personally affect you? Is it going to make it cheaper for you to manage your landscape? Is it going to make it easier for you to manage your landscape? Are you going to get certain benefits that you're specifically looking for? You want to zone in on those things because regeneration is hard and it takes a long time and it's expensive. So make sure it's worth it for you. If you are planning on flipping your house in 5 years, this might not be the land management um, approach that you need, or at least not a full regeneration responsive management plan. Really consider what are your different options. Um, then what is it that you expect from the space? What are you trying to use it for? Are you wanting a gathering space? Do you want more usability around your home? You want to plant fruit trees? Like what is the landscape going to be in your mind? That's also going to help you discern whether or not this is something that makes sense for you, right? Because there might be another option that really works better for you. That doesn't mean that you don't care about the planet or want things to die. So don't feel bad. So in deciding, how you're going to set your goals up and what you want to achieve, you should think about how the space feels when you move through it and what is it that you want to get out of it when it's at the point that you would consider done, right? You've reached your goals. So what does it evoke for you now? How does it feel? Is it cozy? Is it nice and open? Are there spaces for you to kick a soccer ball around? Is there, somewhere with a fire pit? These are things you want to know, because it'll help you plan and make better decisions on the front end, and respond to how things change over time. Also, what are the things that you like to do and what are things you don't like to do? Do not create the kinds of management that you hate, right? If you absolutely hate pruning things, don't plant something in an area where you're going to have to prune it regularly. These are things to think about. And we see this very often with people who are doing their own landscaping, you know, not entirely considering how something is going to grow over time or that they maybe hate mowing or they hate dealing with leaves or whatever, or that a certain tree drops, you know, gumballs or in inconvenient places. You're going to have to deal with these things over time. So try and not make tasks that you abhor. All right. So you've done all this planning. Now you can start to use some observation to really like nail down your goals. You've been looking at your site. You've got to think about, okay, what are the limiting factors, right? Um, what is my landscape able to do and not able to do? Do I have steep slopes? Do I live in an area where I have seasons to consider? So you have the site conditions that are immediately around your home. You have the conditions of your neighbors, right? Because their conditions are your conditions. You've got your city at large, maybe. Maybe you have even a larger area you need to consider that's affecting you. Remember when that horrible smog came through Atlanta, right? So just because something isn't happening next door does not mean it's not going to affect you. What other obstacles might exist on your site? Here we have someone from our team pulling up some landscaping fabric. Please don't ever do this. Ugh, you know, but there are all kinds of things that you're going to find in your yard, rubble, just trash, um, or like boulders, you know, retaining walls. What are the things that you're not going to move necessarily or that is going to get in your way? You want to know what these things are, kind of plan for them before you come into contact with them, if you possibly can. Of course, you're not going to catch every single little thing. Consider your resources. This means how much time do you have to devote to this and how much of a budget do you have to devote to this? You should really think about budgeting a regeneration project. If you're trying to regenerate a whole yard, which most Atlanta yards are around a 16th of an acre, from what I've found, that's moderately infested with invasives and has been like that over the past 10 or so years. This is kind of like the median. Uh, that's a investment. That's a big investment. The same way that you would invest in something like a car or higher education. It's gonna take some money. So we're talking tens of thousands of dollars a lot of the time over the span of multiple years. Minimum 5 usually, but I tell my clients, at the very least 3 for for a project. We don't make people commit to all 3, but I make it very clear that it takes 3 years at least to establish a meadow. So if you go back to that idea of time scale, right? The landscape needs a certain amount of time to do the things that we're expecting of it. It'll do those things for sure, but it needs that time and it needs that support. Are there any restrictions or regulations where you live? Are you in a conservation easement? Do you have HOAs you need to think about? Neighborhood stuff, all things you want to consider before you start regenerating. My favorite part of observation, uh, call this forest forensics. What is the space being used for and by whom? And of course, I mean people, right? Your family. Who are your family members? Yourself. How do you guys move through the space? How does the neighborhood move through space, if that's the thing? But also all of our non-human neighbors. So are there signs of activity that you can already start to parse out? Seeing seeing wildlife is a great way to know that they're there, but a lot of the time you're not going to see them. So you have to look for the signs that they've been there. Deer, most of us understand deer scat is a pretty good sign that they've been through, and they tend to leave prints pretty prominently. But we also have lots of coyotes in Atlanta, so that's for sure a consideration. You know, um, Deer eating your stuff, coyotes being a threat to other things. They definitely eat pets. So you want to know who your neighbors are and whether or not you're trying to invite them more into the space, if you can kind of accommodate them as much as possible because they're already there. So you want to work with these things rather than against them. And if you understand who who's around you and how they're using your space, you won't feel like you're fighting with them as much. You can also start to identify what kind of predictable issues you're going to have down the line as you start to see how your goals might interact with the behavior of your landscape. So, a very common one, of course, is erosion, right? We start to take things away, we start to take away the protective vegetative layer, then we're going to get erosion. And as we destabilize the landscape, we're going to get erosion. So we can pretty much know that that's always going to happen, but also new species moving into those disrupted areas. Sometimes those are native species. Most of the time, they're invasive species. Understanding at this point, you should know. Whoop, my roommate upstairs just dropped something. You should know by collecting all of this observation at this point, what is it that your landscape will absolutely never be able to do, and what it could very likely do and do quite well. So, a floodplain is never going to be a xeric landscape. You're going to put a bunch of cacti there. That's a very obvious one. But when you become more familiar with how even water flows through your yard, right? You can place things better. You can plant things in better places. You can understand where you need to stabilize. And it all comes down to making better decisions over time. So that brings us to our regeneration guidelines. And at our core, Ecologic really ascribes to this philosophy of eco over ego. It sort of encompasses everything you would want to do when you are trying to take a regenerative approach. And what this truly means is You set aside your ego and focus on the ecology solely. Because in doing so, we understand that we are part of the ecology. What is best for the space, what heals the space the most, will inevitably create the things that we want from it. So when we think of what conventional landscaping does for us, right? Creating things like privacy, site definition, um, beauty, inviting different types of critters into our space, bringing food for us, good smells, all of these things, all of them exist within the native species palette, and more so than the plants that are available to you with conventional landscaping. The difference is that with these native environments, we get resilience, right? And this is ultimately what regeneration and that healing is hinting at, is that resilience means we don't get those kinds of failures like erosion, compounding and creating so many problems for us, trees falling, all the things that we're afraid of um, around our homes. It's that resilience that we need in our environment that will prevent all of those dangers. How do you build that into your plan and your approach? You have to stack your functions within your interventions. So you really shouldn't be doing anything for one reason. You do things for 2, 3, 4, 5, however many different things you can support. Those are going to be the best interventions. And usually the simplest interventions are those that have the most multiple stacked functions. I'm going to show you one in a second. But back to resilience, what that comes to is that it's just biodiversity, because biodiverse is inherently the most resilient type of ecology you can have. And as it turns out, it's always beautiful. If it's a biodiverse environment and it's healthy, they're just beautiful inherently. So you don't have to plan for that so much. Planning for the biodiversity will give you what you're craving and all of those, shapes and textures and colors, all of those experiences. What you're really wanting is the biodiversity. So what I'm showing you right here is a natural construction that we implement regularly, habitually. These are called brush berms, and I would forgive you for thinking that they were piles of sticks, because they are. They're absolutely piles of sticks, but they are piles of sticks with intention, which, all of this really comes down to intention, right? Intention before intervention. Your sticks, what makes them a brush berm as opposed to just a collection of sticks, is they should be stabilized along a slope or a disrupted area, because what that does is it holds the landscape in place, right? It prevents things from washing away, and it actually collects that leaf litter, so you end up over time getting a nice sort of very subtle terracing effect. And they can be quite beautiful. You can make them as big and as long as you want. The idea is that you weave together your limbs, your larger fallen pieces, and even what you've taken out of the mid-story, or you know, your woodies for invasives. Once those are dead, you can incorporate them in this way that stabilizes areas that you've worked heavily. And this way you also have somewhere to manage your debris over time. So in my examples here, you can see them. The The one on the bottom, I guess that's right, is in next to someone's retaining wall, which it worked wonderfully to divert water away from that retaining wall. We also did a very subtle riffle and streamway in there, and it protected the new plantings along the slope. The other two pictures are in Fernbank Forest, and those have been in Fernbank Forest since we first started doing regeneration in the forest back in 2019 now. And they this is what they look like after 5 years. So they were larger, and you can see that they just they just sort of melt into the landscape beautifully. They can be quite subtle. Moving on with eco over ego. Almost more important than how you are intervening with the landscape is when you are intervening with the landscape. All of these things, all of these behaviors we're talking about, they happen on a cycle. So, hey, you missed, the autumn cycle, the best moment to do a planting of a certain thing. That's okay. You have next year. Just plan for it. Start to create a calendar. Start to notice, when are the optimal times to do certain things, to take out certain species. When are you going to have an overabundance of certain species that you already know it's coming because you've noticed it from the year before? Then you can preempt these things, right? As you start to notice the seasonality, this is why regeneration works so well, because we're seeing what happens in the world and we're responding to it instead of moving through the world, blind to it, just sort of bumping into things and expecting that it will respond to us the way that we want it to. Um, and to that point, you know, we talked about the brush berms. Ultimately, what those are doing, not only are they, managing your debris, keeping the area neat, also sort of signifying to you where you've already worked. They're like a cue for you and a space for wildlife to use. But the main thing that they're doing is preventing that erosion. That's what we talked about. And that all of that comes down to preserving the soil health, preserving soil integrity, because that's the basis, of our ecology. If the soil isn't there, we don't have the substrate for things to grow. And that's ultimately where we want things to go. So how do you keep your landscape doing well with aftercare? I could go back, but the brush berms are very much a part of aftercare. Anytime you disrupt the ground, you want to tamp things down, cover them up, and make sure that you have stabilized things back to at least as good as they were, if not better. A couple more guidelines for you guys as you're really thinking about what types of regeneration goals you could undertake in your project. Access is your number one concern before you do anything else, because you can't actually implement any of your interventions if you can't get to where you need to implement them. And it's amazing how often this stumbles people up. But think about it, right? if if you're worried about the English ivy on the trees, but there's a bunch of briars around the trees, you have to get them out of the way so that you can get to the other thing. And not only that, you know already that you're going to have to keep the English ivy off of the trees, so you have to maintain that access to that point over time. And really what you're doing is just making it easy for yourself. It's easier to navigate your home when it's clean and things are tidy and organized and put away than it is when you have to move things out of your way to get to the kitchen to cook or do whatever it is you're trying to do. So ultimately, it just comes down to organization and reducing the obstacles um, that you would create for yourself over time or that can easily be mitigated. Like another one is having debris collections that get overgrown with other things. It's very easy to keep the vines away or put down cardboard or something, put your debris in another space so it doesn't get grown over and then you don't have to deal with that. Oh, here's another one. See those little nubbins? God, the deadly nubbins. That would be an example of not maintaining access, right? You know that if you have a stump of an invasive, they're going to grow back. And if you leave those little bits, what happens? It grows new little bits, and you can't get in there to cut them. So it can grow more, and then it can grow more, and then it can grow more, and then it can grow more. Same reason why you don't ever want to let your invasives establish along a fence line, because once they're in there, right, that's so much harder to deal with. Just prevent it to begin with. You know how it's going to behave. You understand. Um, the other pictures are just some examples of what what managing your debris looks like as part of maintaining access. And managing your debris can be really like a helpful aesthetic, like signifying, hey, here's a path. Hey, here's a planting. That means you're going to have to process your debris and sort it, and sometimes let it die if it's an invasive plant. But we're going to talk more about that at another time. The last set of guidelines that I see people getting hung up on and keeping themselves from going out and doing this themselves is they get hurt. They don't know how to hold themselves properly. So know what proper body mechanics are before you go out there and start using your body in an aggressive way. Have the proper gear. Um, know what to do if you get stung by something or if you come across a snake, and what are the different types of snakes? How should you behave? These are all things that you want to consider because the reality is this is what our landscape is. And that's part of understanding who is using the space and how. So that was a lot talking about regeneration, but moving forward with those ideas, what should we be thinking about next? So at this point, now we can start to think about what are the tools and techniques that I'm going to use to implement, you know, my my vision. How am I going to experiment and do better? So how do I make the kinds of mistakes that are actually helping me and not taking away any progress that I've made? And at the very end there, yeah, you should talk about some plant ID and get yourself a plant ID thing. But you notice I put it at the end because it's not the most important thing to implementing a regenerative approach. So that is the first part of our series on regeneration. I would like to thank you all. If you want more tips and interventions, we're going to be covering the actual interventions and tips for how to avoid the common mistakes we see in the next two parts. And feel free to join us.
We did have some questions that came in that I'd love to share. The first one you may have covered a little bit, but Pat asked, after you remove English ivy from a steep hill, how do you stop the erosion?
Well, hopefully you've started to stop the erosion before you've removed all of the English ivy. And what I mean by that is you don't remove all of the English ivy all at once. Because you know if it's a steep slope that, well, you've got nothing left, inevitably, it's going to wash off. So if that's how you do it, you're stuck either putting something down, which this is why people put down landscape cloth. You know, if you want to be more eco-friendly, you can put down that burlap woven stuff. But I would recommend using, right? Regeneration is always all about using what's there. Use the fact that the ivy is holding the hillside in place already. So just take away as much as it will stand and then start to replace the poison ivy. You can start to plant into it. You can even start to seed into it. You might consider, doing a combination of smothering it. We love wood chips for smothering. We love wood chips all around because they're one of those multifunctional things. They do so many things. They're going to feed the soil. They're going to keep overgrowth down, and they're going to prevent erosion as well and hold things in place, stabilize. So rather than thinking about it, step one is get rid of the English ivy. Step two is stabilize. All of this is much more fluid than that. You are stabilizing while you are getting rid of the English ivy, right? It is part of the same system and process. They're not separate things. I hope that answers the question. Oh, you're on mute there, Elizabeth.
There we go. The second part of that question was, it takes a while for the native plants to grow and cover the area in which have been removed. And are those some of the tips that you just mentioned ways to minimize weeds that take over until the native plants have a chance to kind of fill in?
Well, I think we need to
Cover.
understand better what is meant by weeds. Because, back to one of the first points I made is there's a perspective shift here, right? So what you are considering a weed, is it actually something that's helping you? Is it providing some of that biodiversity or some of those early stages of succession that need to happen? And you're not necessarily recognizing that because it's behaving in a certain way, right? That we've defined as weedy. Um, those are things to consider. If it's like, invasive annuals, things like, like the Persian speedwells and the chickweed and all those kinds of things, I really like, again, the wood chips to keep things at bay. They're just wonderful for, I mean, it's better than mulch, truly, because the chips are never going to be treated, and it's the entire tree, right? And it's a living tree. So you get the process of it decomposing, whereas mulch is, what's that called? Is cured, and it doesn't decompose like that. Doesn't feed the soil and aerate it in the same way. I feel like I got off topic on that one. I'm sorry, Elizabeth.
No, that was great. Another question is, somebody has found chemicals and toxins in their yard from various industries that Atlanta created. Their plan is to heal the soil and remove the toxins. Do you have any resources or recommendations for this process?
Well, I know that there was a program being run recently. Wasn't it Georgia State? This is something I'm going to look up later. We could put somewhere, but one of our local universities was running a program, and it was specifically targeted for the west side of Atlanta, um, looking at soil health and replacing for free um, industrially affected areas, with the kinds of chemicals and toxins that you're talking about. It is really hard as a individual to mitigate that type of damage, usually it's pretty extensive. And, the way that I think common practice is still just like dig it out with a bulldozer because we don't have a practical way to process a lot of these things on a scale that makes sense for humans or you know, for living in a home. But there are some things, there are some plants and not just plants, but fungi that will help with smaller amounts of these things. It depends on like how much we're talking about and what types of things. So like oyster mushrooms, for example, can be used for they do lead uptake and they'll take other types of toxins out of soils and the environment. They're not the only ones. There are other types of mushrooms that you can buy like the crumbles and do the sawdust and the wood chips, of course, and put them around. But I would say, with that type of situation, I wouldn't if it's a lot, don't put anything that you're planning to eat in that yard. Sorry, it's
Thank
not better news.
No, that's great. And we'll try to look and find those resources in the university that you mentioned. Another question is, what tips or general approach do you have for restoring soil and vegetation and preventing further erosion on large, steep wooded hills? Removing invasives, privet, and elaeagnus obviously exposes and destabilizes the soil. You may have touched on this before, but if you have
Right.
any additional.
The brush berms are great, and we're actually going to talk about some of these things in the next talks. So you'll just tune back in. But start with your brush berms and just practicing really simple aftercare. It's all about compounding effects. The compounding effect, just imagine, of filling in every hole that you make and then tamping down that loose soil on a whole hillside. It really makes a difference. If you do that and then on top of that, you plant something every time you've destabilized a space or you reseed it, that's a great starting point. But there are other things that we're going to talk about.
Um, so there was a comment that came in about the soil toxin question from a participant named Chelsea. And Chelsea said that the Saikawa lab at Emory is studying both lead in West Atlanta and theoretical phytoremediation methods. So I will drop that in the chat in
Ooh.
case if people want to look that up, that lab up in Emory.
Thank you, Chelsea.
Sherry asked, how do you define native versus cultivar or hybrid?
Terrific question. Some of you will have noticed that I stayed away completely from defining native, invasive, and all the other terms that we talk about when we're talking about doing regeneration. And the reason is because that's, again, not the most important thing. The most important thing is how much biodiversity are you creating? It just so happens that native habitats are the most biodiverse. So by default, that's what we want. Plants that are not native but don't degrade the habitat, they're just sort of neutral space. And this is what a lot of cultivars actually kind of end up being. So they don't hurt anything a lot of the time, but they don't necessarily provide that resilience, those multifunctional aspects that we want, that we get from biodiversity, that their native wild cousins provide. And a lot of it has to do with the fact that they've just been changed so much. The shape of the flower, right? makes a difference as to what type of pollinator can get in there. How big the leaves are. It makes a difference as to, whether or not a caterpillar could use it, or if it's thicker or thinner. These little subtle changes that we sort of take for granted as being fine, you know, the ecology has evolved over hundreds of millions of years to fit together like a perfect little puzzle. So you misshape one little tiny thing, you might be able to shove it back together, but you keep doing that over and over again, and eventually it's not going to fit. So that's my answer about cultivars. Invasive native uh, is another question entirely, which I had planned to get to in our next talk. So I guess you'll have to wait.
Okay. Thank you. Pat also asked, when you replant a small native shrub, how do you keep people from stepping on them?
Great question. I probably wouldn't plant a small native shrub where people have a tendency to step. Just going back to that idea of like, how's the space already being used? Is it going to be really hard for me to plant something super small in this space? Then I don't want to make my life harder. That's part of the reason that I practice regeneration the way that I do. I want to work with things. It just makes my life easier. So noticing those patterns of where egress and access happen and respecting them, or, building your pathways or whatever to sort of mimic them, is a great idea. If you can't do that, or if there's some reason to have a barrier there, then you might have to use a larger shrub. But signage is always a wonderful tool as well. If you just explain to people what's going on, most of the time they're pretty accommodating, or they want to help. Very rarely people will see a sign and then like go and stomp on your shrub. So
Thank you. Chris asked, do you have any recommendations on resources for learning how to identify native versus invasives in our area? Classes, books, videos, etc.
start by downloading iNaturalist onto your phone and actually reading how to use it. If you learn how to use it to its full capacity, it's a wonderful, wonderful tool, and it will really help you learn what is in your area. But as far as just like plant ID and getting a general sense of what's around Atlanta and what the common invasives and natives are, best way to do that is to learn from other people. And so I would probably just recommend volunteering with one of the very many, many, many opportunities there are to do invasive removal around town. There's no shortage of ways to give your time freely to help get some invasive plants out.
Thank you. Bridget asked, with wood chips, how do you avoid introducing those nasty smelling staghorn mushrooms or other undesirable growths from coming up in the chips? They are not a desirable outcome.
Well, I would say they're just one of those steps that we really have to respect. You know, I like to use this analogy with clients that if you can think of the stages of regeneration the same way you think about how you went through stages to reach where you are in maturity, most of us had an awkward middle school time where we didn't look the coolest or hadn't really figured out who we were. Just think of it like that. It will pass. It's just a stage. But what those mushrooms are doing is vital to what you want from the wood chips. They're breaking it down, they're providing those micronutrients, and they are cycling all of that good stuff, which is how you get the good thing on the other side. You got to go through the stinky part to get to the good part. You don't get to skip it. You can kick them over, you know.
Another question is, how do you decide where to place those brush berms?
Um, you're going to use all of that observation that you've been doing. How is water flowing over your hillside? Where does it need the most stabilization? Where does it need the most support? Right? And also, like, what materials do you have at your disposal? What is within the realm of possibility? And then you'll have a better idea of where to do things. Where's the most disruption? Where's the most help needed?
Thank you. And I know we'll be going over some more of those techniques and also have a chance to put them into practice in the field through this series. So at this time, we don't have any more questions, and we've kind of come to the end of today's time. But I just really want to thank T and thank all of you all for participating. It's just so great to see how many people are excited about forest regeneration and what we all can do in our own backyards. You will be receiving a survey after today's event. It would really help us to continue to approve and serve and give you guys the information that you need and want. If you can fill those out for us and get them back to us. And we hope to see you at the next event in this series with Tea and Ecologic. Thank you.